My son went missing, in-laws go live with rats. Mother-in-law toss leftovers daily, then came $30,000 and a note. Meet at station tonight at midnight, mystery of the letter and the $30,000. You are going to live in the storage room from now on with the mice. Leave Brian to us. As those words reached my ears, I felt all strength leave my body. It was clear they were hiding Brian somewhere. Fear and despair consumed me. I had to escape and get Brian back no matter what, but trapped as I was, that seemed impossible. About a week had passed since this nightmare began. One day, the food container my mother-in-law threw into the room was different. Inside, I found something shocking: a stack of cash. It looked like around $30,000. Among the money was a small slip of paper. It said, "Tonight at midnight, meet me at the nearest station entrance." The short message made my heart pound wildly. It was clear this was my mother-in-law's doing, but I couldn't tell if this was a lifeline or another trap. Still, I couldn't stay locked up forever. Even if it was a trap, I had to take the chance. My name is Sarah James. I'm 29 years old. In my short 30 years of life, I faced many trials. My life began to spiral out of control when I was 12. That winter, I lost both of my beloved parents in a car accident. My carefree days came to an abrupt end. I was forced to move from one relative's house to another. Even as a child, I could feel how much of a burden I was to them. They offered kind words on the surface, but there was always an unbridgeable distance. At some homes, I was made to help with housework. It became difficult to keep up with school. My time with friends dwindled, and loneliness began to consume me. School became my only refuge. In particular, a classmate named Henry was a great comfort to me. He was always cheerful and extended small acts of kindness to me. His warmth reminded me of what I had lost at home. I secretly found solace in his presence. However, when we entered high school, our paths diverged, and re-enrolled in the best high school in the area, known for its academic rigor. Meanwhile, I continued to live with my relatives, working part-time jobs to cover my expenses. I worked harder than anyone else in school, but university was out of the question. My part-time earnings simply couldn't cover the cost of tuition. The frustration of giving up on my dreams weighed heavily on me. After graduating, I started working as a temp employee. A few years passed since high school, and then fate intervened. At a local reunion, I met Henry again. He greeted me with the same warm smile he'd always had. In that moment, it felt like the loneliness of my past was lifted, if only for a moment. That reunion marked a turning point in my life. We were drawn to each other and soon began dating. At 25, we got married. I became a housewife, dedicating myself to supporting our home and family. Marrying Henry brought me happiness I had never known before. For the first time, I felt truly content. But little did I know, this decision would bring new upheavals into my life. Shortly after our marriage, we moved in with Henry's parents. He had always intended to inherit the family home, so it wasn't a surprise. However, living with his parents was far more suffocating than I had anticipated. The source of the tension was my father-in-law, Mike. "Sarah, this is why I have trouble with today's young women. If you can't fulfill your role in the household, then you're no good." His criticisms came daily, relentless and cutting. Mike worked as an executive at a major corporation and never hesitated to flaunt his status. He believed his opinions were absolute. Every morning at breakfast, he would read the newspaper and quiz me about the day's news, but it was never about enjoying conversation. It was just an excuse to find fault with my answers and belittle me. Being a housewife must be easy, right? At the very least, you should be able to manage the household perfectly for the sake of your husband. His words were always harsh and demeaning. At first, I tried to respond with a smile, but over time, I found myself unable to say anything at all. My mother-in-law, Terry, had been a housewife for decades. She was completely submissive to Mike's beliefs. "Sarah, your role is to protect the household. That's your duty." Hearing her words, I felt a wave of disappointment. I secretly hoped she might take my side, but instead, her attitude made me feel betrayed. The only person who seemed to notice my struggle was Henry. "Dad, stop it. Sarah is doing her best in an unfamiliar environment. Give her some slack." Every time he defended me, I felt a little bit of relief, but Mike ignored him completely. "Don't be foolish. If a man is soft on a woman, it will ruin the household. Harry, you need to teach her discipline." These arguments happened again and again, wearing me down emotionally. Mike, being an executive, was home more often than a typical working man. That meant I bore the brunt of his words and pressure while Henry was at work. If breakfast was even a few minutes late, Mike would pursue his lips in irritation. "Sarah, if you can't even manage time, how can you expect to manage anything else? If this were a company, you would be fired immediately." I finally slapped one morning and retorted, "This isn't a company, and I wasn't feeling well this morning." His face darkened, his expression becoming even harsher. Are you arguing with me, the head of this family? Do you think this kind of attitude will keep a household running? Know your place. His raised voice made me feel like the walls were closing in. I knew I had no choice but to endure it until Henry came home, but the weight in my chest grew heavier with each passing day. Sarah, are you okay? Do you think you'll be able to manage here? He asked me gently one night. I nodded silently, unable to bring myself to say the words in my heart. Our cohabitation had just begun, and the thought of what lay ahead filled me with anxiety. A year after our marriage, her son Brian was born. His birth brought indescribable joy, a light in the darkness, but Brian's arrival also made Mike's behavior even harder to endure. To him, Brian was nothing more than the next heir of the James family. His expectations loomed over every aspect of my parenting. Sarah, you're coddling Brian too much. Boys need to be raised strictly. How many times must I tell you? His commanding voice made me shrink back every time he called my name. By the time Brian turned 3, Mike began taking him out on excursions without consulting Henry or me. He would simply announce he was educating Brian and leave the house with him. One day, I confronted him. Mike, at least tell us where you're taking him. Brian is only 3 years old. Where did you go today? He gave me a cold, dismissive look. I don't need to report to you. A mother who spoils her son constantly has no right to question me. When Mike returned with Brian, the boy was often covered in mud or wearing unfamiliar branded clothes. Sometimes, he even came back repeating words I had never taught him. One day, despite Brian feeling unwell, Mike insisted on taking him out. He returned with a feverish Brian who was visibly unwell. Sarah, I told you, Brian wasn't feeling well. Why would you take him out anyway? My voice trembled with anger. If he gets sick from something like this, it just shows how weak he is. It's your fault for raising him so poorly, Sarah. I was speechless. As Brian coughed beside me, Mike merely muttered that he lacked grit. When Harry came home and saw Brian's condition, he immediately confronted Mike. Dad, this has to stop. Brian is only 3 years old. Stop taking him out without telling us. How dare you talk back to me, Henry? Since when did you become so high and mighty? As the two of them argued, Brian clung to me with a frightened expression. Not wanting him to witness more of this chaos, I stepped between them. Please stop. Brian is right here. Let's not argue in front of him. That night, the house was quiet, but I knew Mike's attitude wouldn't change. I decided to avoid further confrontations for Brian's sake. If enduring this could protect our family's peace, I would bear it, but as I kept swallowing my emotions, I felt pieces of myself being chipped away. I couldn't help but wonder how long this life would last. Then in the winter of our 4th year of marriage, tragedy struck. Henry was killed in a car accident. When I received the news, it felt as if time itself has stopped. Henry? Gone? It had to be a mistake. This couldn't be real. While I stood there in shock, Mike's voice rang out cold and stern. There's no time for tears. We need to start preparing for the funeral immediately. It must be dignified and worthy of the James name. Too drained to argue, I simply followed Mike and Terry's instructions. I moved through the motions of the funeral preparations like a puppet. The funeral itself passed in a blur faster than I could comprehend what was happening. The only thing tethering me to reality was the warmth of little Brian in my arms. My heart felt hollow. Time seemed to move without meaning. A few days after the funeral, I woke up one morning to realize something was terribly wrong. Brian wasn't in his room. Mike had insisted we sleep in separate rooms, so every morning I would go check on Brian. But that morning, his bed was empty. Brian, where are you? I searched the house frantically. Every room, every corner, he was nowhere to be found. Panicked, I ran to Mike. Mike, Brian isn't in his room. Where did you take him? I don't know where he is. Stop accusing me of nonsense. His indifferent tone sent chills down my spine. Desperate, I turned to Terry in the kitchen. Terry, have you seen Brian? I haven't. Maybe he's just hiding somewhere. Her evasive response, only deepened by fear. I ran out of the house and searched the neighborhood. The park, the riverbank, every place he loved. But no matter where I looked, he wasn't there. Returning to the house, I was on the verge of calling the police. My hands shook as I reached for my phone. Suddenly, Mike grabbed my wrist. What do you think you're doing? I need to call the police. Brian is missing. He's only 3 years old. What if something happened to him? That's not your decision to make. Your role here is over. His words struck like a hammer. Before I could react, Mike's grip tightened, and Terry swiftly took my phone from my hand. Give it back. I need to call the police. My voice cracked with desperation. You have no right to do anything anymore. Before I could process his words, Mike shoved me into the storage room. Terry slammed the door shut, the sound echoing ominously. Open the door. Let me out. I banged on the door, shouting, but the sturdy storage room didn't budge. You'll live in there from now on with the mice. Leave Brian to us. Those words drained me of all hope. It was clear they had taken Brian and hidden him somewhere. Fear and despair gripped me completely. I had to escape and get Brian back. But locked in the storage room, I couldn't see a way out. Days turned into what felt like weeks as I sat confined in the storage room. The only thing inside was a small portable toilet and a dusty old clock hanging on the wall. That clock became my only way of keeping track of time. Terry would bring me meals in plastic containers once a day, but they were hardly meals, scraps really. "This is plenty for you. You should be grateful you are getting anything at all." Her voice was cold, devoid of any sympathy. At first, I tried to question her. "Where's Brian? Is he safe?" But she ignored me entirely. It became clear she had no intention of answering. My only thoughts were of Brian. Was he okay? Was he scared? The uncertainty gnawed at me constantly. I knew I had to endure it if I wanted to see him again. Then about a week after my confinement began, something unusual happened. Terry threw a food container into the storage room as usual, but this time it felt heavier than normal. I quickly opened it and froze. Inside was a stack of cash, an enormous sum. By my estimation, it was around $30,000. Nestled among the bills was a small slip of paper. The note read, "Tonight at midnight, meet me at the nearest station entrance." My heart pounded as I read the words. It was obviously from Terry, but I couldn't tell if this was a lifeline or a trap. Either way, I knew I couldn't stay locked up forever. Even if it was a trap, I had to take the chance. That night, as the clock struck midnight, I cautiously pushed open the storage room door. To my surprise, it wasn't locked. The house was silent. Holding the container tightly, I stepped outside. The cool night air stung my face. Is it really safe to leave? Doubts swirled in my mind, but I couldn't stop now. I ran as fast as I could through the empty streets. When I reached the station, Terry was waiting near the entrance. She was dressed more plainly than usual, and her face was expressionless. But I noticed a hint of nervousness in her eyes. "You're here." She handed me a ticket, and pulled me through the turnstile. I was too stunned to resist as she pushed me onto the train. In my hands, she pressed a paper bag. "Go to the address written in the snow. Wait there until I come for you." I looked at her, bewildered. "Terry, what's going on? Where's Brian?" She raised her hand, cutting me off. "If you want to protect Brian, do exactly as I say." Her quiet, firm tone silenced me. The train doors closed and the car began to move. Through the window, I saw her figure growing smaller and smaller on the platform. Left alone in the train, I opened the paper bag. Inside were a simple set of clothes and a slip of paper with an address on it. There was no further explanation. "Please, Brian, be safe." My whispered prayer dissolved into the quiet of the train car. My heart was a storm of fear and hope, crashing together in waves. I stared at my reflection in the window, tears streaming down my face. I didn't understand Terry's motives or what would happen next, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like something was changing. The rhythmic motion of train began to calm my nerves, though only slightly. I kept my eyes on the passing darkness outside the window. The address on the slip of paper led me to a small rundown apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. The building looked old, but it was surprisingly well maintained. I clutched the paper bag tightly as I approached the unit Terry had specified. Using the key inside the bag, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The apartment was simple and sparsely furnished, but meticulously clean. A single table and chair sat in the center of the room, and the basic necessities, bed, refrigerator, and stove, were neatly arranged. Checking the fridge, I found it fully stocked with food. Despite Terry's past coldness, the room felt carefully prepared. On the table was a sealed envelope addressed to me. Sarah read in Terry's handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened the letter. The contents of the letter left me breathless. In her neat, precise handwriting, Terry had poured out a truth that shook me to my core. What I am about to share is a secret I have carried for years. Please read this through to the end. It is time you know everything. Terry began by confessing the truth about Henry's birth. Mike, it turned out, had kept a mistress for many years. Her name was Amy Hunter, and she had once worked as a receptionist at Mike's company. When Terry was unable to conceive, Mike decided to have a child with his mistress. Henry was born from that relationship. Mike and I took him in as our own to protect the family's reputation. Terry admitted that Henry had never known the truth. He grew up believing we were his biological parents, and I have often wondered if that was the right choice. She described years of suffering, forced to raise the child of her husband's affair while enduring Mike's control. My family depended on Mike's financial support. If I left him, my parents and siblings would have been destitute. I had no choice but to endure his betrayals and humiliation. Terry's pain seeped through every word. She went on to reveal that Brian was currently with Amy. Amy always wanted to raise Brian as her own, seeing him as the next heir to the James name. Mike allowed it, indulging her whims despite knowing it was wrong. Terry admitted that Amy had been a frequent presence. She had visited often, under the pretense of bonding with Brian. I have always regretted not standing up to Mike. I regret allowing this family's legacy to destroy so many lives, but I want to make things right. Terry ended the letter with a plea for me to trust her. The money I gave you is all I have. Use it as you see fit, but please stay hidden until I can come to you. When I finished reading, I set the letter down and stared at the ceiling overwhelmed. The secrets of the James family, the lies that Henry had never known, and Terry's long-buried pain pressed heavily on my chest. I couldn't process it all at once, but one thing was clear. I had to protect Brian. I folded the letter carefully and wiped away my tears. I needed to plan my next steps carefully if I wanted to rescue my son. The next morning, I woke to the sound of the apartment buzzer. My heart raced as I approached the door. When I opened it, Terry was standing there. She looked exhausted, her face pale and drawn. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I truly don't know how to apologize for everything I've done." She knelt on the ground, bowing deeply, tears streaming down her face. For the first time, that I see stoic Terry I had always known was gone. "Mike's control over me, it's no excuse. I failed to protect you, but I promise you, no matter what it takes, we will get Brian back." I stared at her, uncertain of what to say. Before reading her letter, I would never have forgiven her. But now, knowing her truth, I could see the deep pain she carried. I knelt beside her and placed my hand on her shoulder. "It's okay, Terry. I don't hate you. Let's focus on rescuing Brian, together." She looked up at me, her face a mix of relief and determination. Terry explained that Mike still believed I was locked in the storage room. She had continued to pretend I was there, bringing food to the locked door to keep up the ruse. "He doesn't suspect anything yet, but we need to act quickly before he realizes." Together, we devised a plan to locate Brian. Terry suggested planting a GPS tracker in Brian's favorite backpack. She would pass it to Mike, ensuring it would eventually reach Amy. If the backpack ends up at her place, we'll know where she's keeping him. I nodded, gripping my phone tightly, ready to monitor the GPS signal. Hours later, the signal moved. The location led to a high-rise luxury apartment building. Terry and I arrived and waited outside, observing the entrance. Finally, as evening fell, we saw them, Mike, Amy, and Brian, leaving the building. "Brian." I called out before I could stop myself. Hearing my voice, Brian turned and broke into a wide smile. "Mommy." He ran toward me, his tiny arms outstretched. I scooped him up, holding him tightly as tears streamed down my face. "It's okay, Brian. Mommy's here now. I won't let you go again." The tender moment was interrupted by Mike's furious voice. "How dare you show your face here?" His face was red with rage as he stormed toward me. "Brian belongs with us. He's the heir to the James family. You have no right to take him." Holding Brian close, I met their anger with unwavering resolve. "Brian is my son. I won't let either of you take him again. I will hold you accountable for everything you've done. Kidnapping Brian and imprisoning me. Accountable? Don't make me laugh. Do you know who I am? No one can touch me." I pulled a small recording device from my pocket and held it up. It had been recording their every word. At that moment, several police officers emerged from behind us. "Mike James, Amy Hunter, please come with us." Mike froze, his confidence draining from his face. Officers moved in, and despite their protests, both were handcuffed and led away. Holding Brian tightly, I watched as the police cars drove off, the sirens fading into the distance. Brian clung to me, his little body trembling with tears. "I'm so sorry, Brian," I whispered, "but you're safe now. I missed you, Mommy." His small voice broke my heart, and I held him even closer, vowing never to let him go again. As I comforted Brian, I felt Terry step closer to us. Her face, for the first time in years, showed a softness I'd never seen before. "Sarah, I'm so sorry for everything, and I have one more thing I need to do." Her tone was resolute, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" "I need to turn myself in." My eyes widened in disbelief. "Terry, you don't have to do that. You helped us. You saved Brian and me. There's no reason for you to face punishment." "That's not true, Sarah. I played a part in your suffering. I locked you in that storage room. Even if it was to protect Brian, I can't ignore my own actions." I tried to reason with her, but her resolve was unshakable. "This is my way of atoning for everything I've done." Her voice was calm, but her words carried the weight of years of guilt and pain. With tears in my eyes, I watched as Terry walked toward the police officers who were still nearby. She calmly explained everything, from Mike's crimes to her role in locking me up. Her corporation was instrumental in solidifying the case against Mike and Amy. Terry's honesty and regret earned her leniency in court. She received probation and community service instead of jail time. Mike and Amy, on the other hand, faced harsh sentences. The evidence Terry provided revealed years of embezzlement and corruption in Mike's business dealings. The scandal rocked his company, and Mike was stripped of his position and assets. Amy was found complicit in the crimes and faced her own punishment. Both of them were left to face the consequences of their greed and cruelty. Meanwhile, I focused on rebuilding a life for Brian and me. I invited Terry to live with us after she was released from her probationary obligations. At first, she hesitated. "Sarah, I don't want to impose on you and Brian. I've already caused enough harm." But I held her hand and looked her in the eye. "Terry, none of that matters anymore. Brian needs his grandmother. And I think we both need you too." Brian chimed in with a shy, but determined voice. "I want Grandma to stay with us." His words seemed to lift the last bit of doubt from Terry's heart. She smiled softly and nodded. Her new life as a family of 3 began. Though the apartment was small, it was filled with warmth and love. Terry became an integral part of our lives, helping with Brian and managing the household while I worked. Brian grew closer to her, calling her Grandma without hesitation and often seeking her comfort. Watching their bond grow was a source of healing for all of us. A few months later, we all visited Harry's grave together. Standing under a clear blue sky, we placed flowers on the gravestone. I knelt down and spoke quietly in my heart. "Harry, Brian is growing strong. Your mother is with us too. Rest easy, knowing we are safe and together." Beside me, Brian placed a small bouquet on the grave. "Thank you, Daddy." His small voice carried a weight of gratitude far beyond his years. Terry stood silently, her eyes closed, as if offering a silent prayer. Despite the lingering pain of losing Harry, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I would protect Brian, nurture his happiness, and honor Harry's memory. On the way back, Brian held both our hands and looked up at us with a bright smile. "Let's visit Daddy again soon. Mommy? Grandma?" His words brought smiles to both Terry and me. We have found a new beginning of new strength and a new family. And together, we would build a future filled with love and hope.